As I said in my last video, during high school, I had hoped that I would grow out of my anxiety, and I thought that anxiety would magically fade away in college. But in college, my anxiety unfortunately became much worse, and as a result, so did my depression. Whereas in high school, I think there were still times when I felt free of anxiety, or at least didn't think about it. In college, anxiety was pretty much always with me. It was at least something that I was always aware of. There was one time, for example, in college when I arrived just a bit too late to an awards ceremony. The students were already seated. I could have found my seat before the ceremony started, but I just couldn't get over my fear of walking in front of everybody. And I hated myself for this, but my fear of being the center of attention was so great that it outweighed the disgust I would feel for myself for not taking a seat and for missing the event. And so to my parents who were in attendance and expecting to see me, of course, I lied by saying that I had arrived too late for the ceremony. I beat myself up over this for weeks afterwards. I remember thinking, what did it matter that I was a good student? What did anything matter really if I were such an idiot that I couldn't even walk in front of a group of people? This is just one tiny example of many of how anxiety affected me, and it's really not a painful example for me even now. It wasn't a painful example then so much, but I just talk about it here to show how anxiety is with us pretty much all the time, how it affects everything day to day. I'm sure if you have social anxiety, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I could tell you a lot more painful stories, and I can tell you even pretty much some funny stories if I think about them now. But this is just one example. Anxiety it's with us all the time, and maybe that's why it's hard even to tell our friends about it, because it happens in so many different situations, and even we don't know, I think even we don't know sometimes why we do some things that are so irrational. I still did all right academically in college, although my grades did suffer more, especially in my later years, when there was a participation or a presentation element to some class grades. My fear of class presentations got so bad that by my senior year, if I could afford to miss the preceding class, I would exercise as much as possible right up until class time. I would jog myself into exhaustion because I found that if I were physically tired, my mind would be less able to focus on the worry. This helped sometimes to reduce my anxiety, but of course you can imagine it didn't really help me to give quality class presentations either. I would actually jog with my backpack on, and I remember jogging around the football stadium and jogging right up to the door of the classroom. Maybe a bigger problem was that I had a lot of trouble deciding on a major because of anxiety. There were courses I wanted to try, but I was too worried about their social demands. For example, I wanted to study architecture, but I had heard that it required a lot of class presentations, and so I pretty much avoided any major like that. And I couldn't really imagine myself in most careers. I couldn't imagine myself meeting strangers. I couldn't imagine myself in business meetings, so certainly it's hard to think about a major when you can't see yourself doing things like that. Another thing I would do when picking classes was I'd like to pick classes based upon class size and time of day. I preferred the big lecture classes in which the teacher never called on the students, obviously. I tended to do well in those classes and not so well in the smaller discussion groups. For my Spanish classes, I did another thing. I tended to pick the first 8 a.m. time class slot because I figured that students would be too tired or too hungover even to really pay much attention to me, which proved sort of true. 8 a.m. classes aren't very popular with most college kids. Of course, I never told anyone these things. I mean, how could I admit to my parents that I was making these sorts of decisions based upon these reasons? It seemed pretty crazy, and it would have been pretty embarrassing to admit that to anybody. I even had a hard time talking to my classmates outside of class. I didn't want to be around anyone who knew that I was quiet in class, or to be around anybody who had seen me looking nervous, for example. And this is something that goes back to high school too. If I thought somebody had seen me looking nervous in a situation, I pretty much tried to avoid them, or I tried to, block them out of my life so that I wouldn't have to think about the situation again. In college, there were also lots of things that I wanted to do, but anxiety got in the way. I had always dreamed of studying abroad, but I couldn't imagine the prospect of feeling even more nervous in a foreign country. I wanted to get a part-time job on campus, but I was nervous of any type of customer service job, and I felt pretty ashamed for the real reason that I wasn't working. And as much as I really did want to study Spanish and some other foreign languages, I absolutely dreaded sitting in those type of classes much more than I did in other type of classes.